The Tour de France is behind us. The Vuelta is coming up soon. So I wanted to record a video here on one of the most popular topics in news stories over the summer, and that is high carbohydrate fueling for performance in the professional peloton. We've got many stories that have talked about athletes consuming over 100 grams an hour of carbohydrate, in some cases 150 grams or more. And the question arises, what is the science behind this practice? Does it work? And if we are going to try and ingest that amount of carbohydrate, what are some things to consider, especially when it comes to the individualized prescription for dietary carbohydrate intake on the bike or in other sports where it might be relevant, like ultra running and marathoning? So historically, if we look at carbohydrate intake guidelines with exercise, going back to the 1990s, you see most recommendations sort of saying anywhere between maybe 30 and 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour was a reasonable recommendation for most athletes to follow, including cyclists. As we move into the early 2000s, the 2010s, you see a shift for the upper range of that recommendation going higher, close to 90 grams to 100 grams an hour. And that was largely the product of research that came out of a variety of labs, but one being run by Asker Drop, and studies that looked at what we call multiple transportable carbohydrates. These are basically different sugars or different carbohydrates that the body can absorb and process differently. So if you think of your intestines, they've got these doors, these transporters that are used to take the sugar from the actual tube where the food is or the carbohydrate is, moves it into the intestinal cell where it then could be dumped into the bloodstream. Different sugars like glucose and fructose use different doors. So if you use a combination of these sugar types, generally we think you can ingest and absorb more carbohydrate during exercise than if you rely on one single source. So for example, if you mix 50 grams of maltodextrin, which is glucose, plus 40 grams of fructose, you can more effectively absorb that 90 grams than if you had all 90 grams from maltodextrin. What we're looking at here is a graph from a paper by Asker Drop that talks about these different carbohydrate sources and how well they're oxidized alone in combination. And what we see, generally speaking, is that if you use a single source like glucose, the amount that you're able to oxidize is somewhat limited. You might only be able to oxidize, for example, 50 grams an hour of glucose, even if you were to ingest 110 grams an hour. So it's a relatively low oxidation efficiency. When you combine sugar sources, though, say maltodextrin and fructose or glucose and fructose, you get a significantly higher oxidation rate, exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rate. And you can get well above 60 grams an hour of that carbohydrate being oxidized. At some point, though, you keep going higher and higher intake rates, and that oxidation efficiency starts to reduce. Meaning you're not oxidizing 90% or 80% or higher. You're starting to lose some efficiency there. So you can keep ingesting more carbohydrate, but at some point, you're not going to get much return on your investment. So these are the types of studies that support the idea that, consuming 90 to 100 grams an hour, you can maybe oxidize 80% of that if you use multiple transportable carbohydrates. Now, another piece of evidence that was used in the development of the recommendations to stay sort of below 90 grams an hour are studies like this one, where they took 51 cyclists and triathletes, had them do 2 hours of constant load riding at 95% of a workload that elicited 4 millimoles of blood lactate. And then they had them do a 20-kilometer time trial performance test after those 2 hours. And they gave these cyclists different amounts of carbohydrate ranging from 10 grams an hour all the way up to 120 grams an hour in sort of stepwise dosages. The source of carbohydrate here was sort of a fructose, maltodextrin, glucose mixture. And what they found, as you see in this graph, is basically sort of a curvilinear relationship between carbohydrate dosage and performance. And they found roughly at 78 grams an hour was the sweet spot for best performance. And there was seemingly diminishing returns as you went above that level. So looking at studies like this one, looking at studies from the lab of Ashka Yukendrop and others, sort of painted a picture that anywhere from 60 to 90 grams an hour was sort of the intake range that would be recommended for most cyclists, for most athletes who wanted to optimize their performance. Back in 2020, when I wrote the book, The Athlete's Gut, which talks a lot about these types of issues, the chapter of carbohydrate that I wrote discusses these carbohydrate recommendations. And at that time, I sort of wrote 90 grams an hour for most athletes is sort of the upper end that they'd want to target. Nowadays, though, we have many examples from different sports, including cycling, where athletes are ingesting 100, 120, 150, even beyond that in rare cases, grams of carbohydrate for every hour that they're performing. We saw stories over the Tour de France of riders like Ben Healy ingesting large amounts of carbohydrate during some of those stages where he was really full pedal to the metal and really asserting himself in those stages. What does the science actually say, though, about if you consume 120 grams an hour? Is that beneficial to your performance? Does it impact metabolism? Does it do things that are theoretically positive for bioenergetics or your use of carbohydrate or fat? So I'm going to go through a few studies here that have actually fed athletes something like 120 grams an hour during performance and exercise and compared that to lower amounts like 90 grams an hour. The first study here is by Andy King and colleagues. And what they did is they took 10 trained cyclists and had them do several rides for 2 hours at 77% of VO2 max, followed by a 30-minute performance test. And they ingested different amounts and types of carbohydrate under these conditions. In one condition, it was 60 grams an hour. Another, it was 75 grams an hour. Those are both from glucose. And then in two other conditions, it was 90 and roughly 113 grams an hour in sort of a combination of glucose and fructose. And what they looked at here was performance, but also importantly, changes in metabolism and use of different energy sources. And what you see here, as summarized in the discussion of this article, is that they found that the high carbohydrate condition at 113 grams an hour of glucose and fructose actually resulted in what appeared to be an overdose effect, where they found increased reliance on liver and muscle glycogen for energy with a suppression of fat oxidation. So sort of counter to what you might want with ingesting carbohydrate during exercise. Usually one of the goals with ingesting carbohydrate during exercise is to rely less on your muscle glycogen stores. Whereas they found almost an opposite effect here. When you get this high of an intake, you see a bit of an increase in the reliance on muscle glycogen plus a reduction in fat use. Now, in terms of performance itself, they found that the 90 gram an hour condition was probably associated with improved performance relative to the other conditions. But this is an interesting study in that it shows, metabolically speaking, ingesting that amount of carbohydrates might actually be disadvantageous for some athletes, at least in the context of this 2-hour exercise followed by 30-minute time trial that was done in this particular study. Now, there's another study I want to talk about here from Tim Podlegar and colleagues who looked at 120 grams an hour of carbohydrate versus 90 grams an hour of carbohydrate during the course of 3 hours of cycling in an overnight fasted state, sort of at an intensity equivalent to 95% of their gas exchange threshold. Ultimately, what they found in this study was that the 120 gram an hour condition did result in higher exogenous carbohydrate burning, meaning burning of the carbohydrate that they ingested, but it did not produce a reduction in the reliance on stored carbohydrate. So again, one of the advantages or supposed advantages of ingesting large amounts of carbohydrate would be that it reduces your reliance on using your stored glycogen. In this case, they didn't find that in this study, although they did find that the higher carbohydrate intake did result in a bit higher carbohydrate burning from that ingested source. So putting the results of these two studies together, what we can see is that there's not a clear reduction in reliance on stored carbohydrate. You're not burning less glycogen by ingesting these really high rates of carbohydrate. And there isn't a clear performance advantage, albeit only one of these two studies actually directly looked at performance. So at least from these studies, there's not a clear advantage metabolically of using these high ingestion rates of 120 grams an hour. And in terms of performance, we don't know. There's not evidence directly from studies that support this idea that ingesting 120 grams is going to be advantage over ingesting 90 grams an hour. So beyond those studies looking at sort of the metabolic changes with high carbohydrate fueling, there's also some studies that have looked at the sort of recovery aspects of high carbohydrate ingestion. The one that's most well known and has been, I think, referenced the most when people talk about recommending these high carbohydrate intakes is this study by Viribe that was published a few years ago, where they gave mountain marathoners different amounts of carbohydrate during the course of the race, looking at 60, 90, and 120 grams an hour. And then afterwards, they evaluated changes from baseline in measures of exercise-induced muscle damage. And what they found and reported was that the group that got 120 grams an hour over the course of the race experienced less of a rise in these muscle damage markers, at least several of them. So, for example, you can see creatine kinase, lactate dehydrogenase, and GOT, which are sort of markers of muscle damage that are in the blood, did not go up as much in the experimental 120 gram per hour condition as what was found in the 60 and 90 gram an hour conditions that seem to have a higher increase in those markers, those blood markers from pre to post race. Now, this is definitely a really interesting study. It involved high level runners, including a couple of world champions, which were reported in the methods. At the same time, there are some issues with this study in terms of being able to really be confident that these findings are absolute. The first is that the sample size was incredibly small. We've got 20 runners spread across 3 groups. On average, we're looking at roughly 7 people per group, which by the standards of this type of design, where people are in separate groups, that's a very, very, very small sample size, which means just simply that we want to be more cautious about how we interpret these results and how easily they could be replicated. Secondarily, when I look at the results here and you see these reductions in blood markers of muscle damage, what I would expect to see perhaps is that there's actually a dose response, so that when you go from 60 to 90, there's a reduction. And when you go from 90 to 120, there's a further reduction. But we don't see that. We see in this case that only the 120 gram per hour group had a reduction relative to the other two. So ultimately the question is, why would we see a reduction from 90 to 120 grams an hour, but not really a reduction from 60 to 90 grams an hour? It's possible that there's a threshold effect that you have to give above a certain level of carbohydrate intake. And that's something that future research should certainly explore and look at. So overall, this is a very interesting study. It was done in a naturalistic environment. So kudos to the authors in terms of how it was done. That being said, I would be cautious about taking the results of this particular study and being conclusive about the benefits of high carbohydrate intake on reducing muscle damage with something like mountain marathoning. So as it stands right now, the studies that have looked at intake levels at, let's say, 110 grams and above, and compared that to somewhat lower amounts, like 90 grams an hour, We either don't see a consistent benefit to metabolic effects or performance, or in the case of the muscle damage study, I think those results are preliminary and I'd want to see them replicated again before I would be confident in them. So overall, the evidence does not really support this idea that 120, 130, 40, 50 grams an hour is superior to 90 grams an hour. That being said, we have many athletes who are committed to this and convinced that it is providing a benefit. And I don't think it's appropriate to discount those anecdotal experiences because I think they probably are telling us something about some potential benefits of ingesting these high amounts of carbohydrate. So, what might be these theoretical benefits to consuming high amounts of carbohydrate at rates well over 100 grams an hour? I think there's a few possible ways that this could be translating to performance improvements, especially in something like professional cycling. Let's think about the Tour de France, for example. The winner of the race might be spending on average 80 hours on their bike over the course of 3 weeks. If we look at an athlete that increases their carb intake from, let's say, 90 grams an hour to 120 grams an hour on the bike and average that over the entire race, that's going to be an extra 115 grams per stage and an extra 2,400 grams of carbohydrate over the whole entire race. And what I think that is doing, or could be doing for a lot of these athletes, is just helping them to get in carbohydrate much more easily and successfully throughout the totality of the whole race. And ultimately, that might also help when they're doing it on the bike to potentially reduce some of the catabolic stress that might be happening if you're ingesting lower amounts of carbohydrate. But in the end, I think a lot of this might be just you're ingesting an extra, couple thousand grams of carbohydrate over the whole entire race. That's going to help you sustain muscle glycogen levels better than when you're not ingesting as much carbohydrate on the bike. We certainly need studies to show that this is the case, that athletes by ingesting more on the bike, they're actually ingesting more carbohydrate in total. So I'd hope to see some studies looking at it in the future. Another possibility here is that when you ingest more carbohydrates per hour, it might mean that you're actually more frequently consuming that in terms of beverages or gels or whatever it is. And that's exposing the oral cavity to carbohydrate more often. We know from other research that when you expose the oral cavity to sweetness and to carbohydrate supplements, that it can improve performance. Now, most of those studies are done in the range of 30 to 60 minutes duration. But I think it's possible that for longer events, that especially as you get into the fourth hour of that stage, that when you're ingesting carbohydrate, you're repeatedly exposing the oral cavity to these carbohydrate supplements, it might stimulate nervous system activity. And that's a potential, albeit speculative, mechanism by which increased ingestion of carbohydrate could be benefiting some athletes. And I think another important point here is that the current research that's been done on high carbohydrate fueling does not really mimic the demands of world-class cycling, especially in multi-week stage races, where you've got back-to-back-to-back-to-back stages that are extremely taxing on the athletes, especially nowadays with the speeds with which they're going at. A one-day study where you ingest 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour versus 90 for a couple of hours doesn't really reflect the ways and the conditions under which high carbohydrate fueling is being applied. So I think there's always going to be some uncertainty here about the science because it's hard to mimic the realities of something like the Tour de France. Now, are there any harms potentially of ingesting carbohydrate above, let's say, 90 grams an hour when there's this absence of evidence that it actually has a clear benefit? I think there's a few things to be concerned about. We already brought one of those up earlier on, and that is an increased reliance on muscle glycogen or an increased breakdown of muscle glycogen because you're sort of oversupplying the body with carbohydrates. And it's creating a hormonal and metabolic environment that actually causes you to burn through your glycogen faster while also reducing your ability to use fat. So that's a potential concern. The gastrointestinal side effects are definitely something to be concerned about, especially if athletes aren't accustomed to those very high intakes. They need to gradually progress their way up from, let's say, something like 90 grams to 100 to 110 to 120. And then for some athletes, this is just, it's a waste of money. If your body can only oxidize, let's say 80 grams an hour of what you're ingesting, but you're ingesting 130 grams of carbohydrate per hour, you're wasting a relatively large amount of carbohydrates. And as we know, these products are oftentimes expensive. May not be a concern for a world tour cyclist who's getting those supplements provided by the team, but for more of a aspiring or amateur athlete who's looking to perform their best, that's a lot of wasted money potentially on something that isn't necessarily adding to your performance. So what are we to do as athletes? Should we just use trial and error to figure out how much carbohydrate we should ingest? How do we know how much of what we're ingesting we're actually burning? Unfortunately, there's not really a practical way to figure that out for most athletes. It really would involve ingesting a type of carbohydrate that's been labeled. It's sort of an isotope form of the carbohydrate that when it's oxidized, the carbon expired in the breath can be measured as a way to quantify the actual amount of oxidation of the ingested carbohydrate and separate that out from your stored carbohydrate. That testing is pretty difficult and especially expensive to do. And there's limited places around the world that are able to kind of do this sort of testing and have the infrastructure ready to do it. Now, there's a company in the UK that's starting to offer home testing, at least for people who live there, and it's called ExoAnalytics. It's sort of something they send you through the mail, and they give you instructions, and then you send the samples back, and they provide an analysis for you. So Jamie Pugh and Sam Impey are a couple of researchers who are behind that venture. So if you're in the UK, that's an option to try that, keeping in mind, though, that that's quite expensive. And we don't necessarily know how static or dynamic these oxidation numbers are, how trainable they are. Do they change with experience of training? Do they change with gut training? Are there other factors that cause them to vary in terms of environmental factors? So that's another caveat with that testing is we don't know how often you should do that testing. Is once enough? Do you have to do it every few months? So practically speaking, it becomes challenging. Now, we also don't know whether or not matching your carbohydrate intake level to your oxidation of that carbohydrate, so trying to match those two things, would translate to better performance. Theoretically, it might, but that's a lot of time and effort and money to potentially spend on something with some uncertainty about how well that's going to actually translate to better performance. Now, there are some things that you can look at, practically speaking, that are less expensive, albeit less accurate, to get an idea about perhaps how much carbohydrate your body might be able to burn and utilize from what you ingest. So there's at least a couple of studies that have found that body size and absolute power output are predictors of how much carbohydrate you can oxidize in grams per hour, for example. So bigger athletes, taller athletes, those with larger surface area, and those who can put out more absolute watts are going to be more likely to oxidize high amounts of what they ingest. So a big cyclist at a world-class level who's able to put out high power numbers and sustain those might be more readily able to oxidize 90 grams an hour or 80 grams an hour of carbohydrate, whereas your amateur athlete, especially smaller, might be only 50, 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour. Now, the height, body mass, surface area, power output, they're not perfect predictors of the ability to burn ingested carbohydrate, but at least they're something that can inform a starting point for an athlete to work from, and then use trial and error, their own experience, to hopefully figure out what seemingly works best for them. In the future, we might have a lot more readily available testing to individualize the prescription of carbohydrate intake for most athletes. But at this point, it's probably going to be limited to world-class athletes who have regular access to this sort of testing, at least for the time being. And then finally, one other thing that should dictate how much you consume is how well you can tolerate that feeding. If your body can oxidize 80 grams of carbohydrate per hour, But if you ingest that amount, it gives you stomach distress. That's something that you have to factor into the equation because ultimately that discomfort, that irritation is going to be a limiter to performance for many athletes. So you need to use your practical experience along with information about how big you are, what your power output is, to get a better idea about perhaps what might be a target carbohydrate ingestion rate for you as an individual cyclist and athlete.